I can see it very clearly.
Perfect. And I'd like to give Scott and Krista an opportunity to just briefly introduce themselves. So Scott, I'll hand it over to you for a moment.
Thanks, Amanda. Hi, Scott Anderson, Millersville University. Been here about 25 years, and I'm responsible for basically all things electronic resources and making sure that platforms talk to each other and students have a reasonably seamless user experience when using the library's electronic resources.
Krista Higham. I've been here about 27 years, and I'm the Access Services Librarian, also in charge of scholarly communication. So I do a lot with interlibrary loan. I also do a lot with our collection development committee. Been chair of that for about 10 years. So.
Fantastic. And for anyone who I haven't met, my name is Amanda Ferrante. I am the product manager for authentication solutions here at EBSCO. And our presentation today, what OpenAthens can do versus what OpenAthens can do for you, is a bit of a case study of Millersville University's OpenAthens implementation. I began working with Scott in Millersville about 3 years ago to set up their OpenAthens. And our goal today is to walk through the case study, but also point out the nuances of their implementation, the parts of Millersville's needs for authentication and how we had to leverage the OpenAthens product to fulfill those needs that made it a little bit different from any other libraries who had been setting up OpenAthens at that time. So we're going to start with some background from Scott and Krista about Millersville, what sort of institution they are. And then we'll review what we had to talk through, really the questions we had to answer before we could actually action their OpenAthens implementation. We'll talk through the timeline and specific conversations we had with Millersville's IT and stakeholders who we had to collaborate with to fulfill certain needs. And you'll see a bit of a demonstration, some examples of usage reporting that we set up, and so on and so forth. And what I think is really fantastic about our relationship with Scott and Krista at Millersville is that even though their OpenAthens implementation has been completed for quite a while now, they still identify ways to optimize that access all the time, whether that's to niche databases, specific software products, new reports, and so on. So we're pretty excited to share with you some of those nuanced aspects of how they're leveraging OpenAthens right now. But first, I'll kick it back over to Scott for some background.
Thanks, Amanda. For those of you that haven't yet heard of Millersville University, I'd almost ask everybody to raise their hand if this is the first time you're hearing about us, because we get a few pounds for doing good PR work from our communications department. But Millersville is a mid-sized master's level institution for the most part. We recently, in the last few years, have launched several what are referred to as professional doctorate programs. This is not the necessarily high-powered research kinds of doctoral programs, but tend to be in the areas of things like health sciences and social work, things like that. FTE, again, going along with the mid-size, we got about 300 faculty, most of which will work on campus, but increasingly, and currently right now, everybody's working off campus. But the trend to having faculty that are living further and further away from the university over the last few years has been up. So nice remote access to library resources has become more important. Libraries down to about 280,000 physical volumes. We peaked out at just shy of 600,000 maybe 10 years ago. We've been doing a lot of weeding and discarding of physical items over the last decade or so. For the last 5 or 6 years now, we have not really been accessioning any kind of physical items except as a last resort. And those physical items would be obviously your traditional monograph, but also we try to avoid accessioning things like DVDs or CDs, anything like that that we can get on streaming. That's the preferred way to do it, even at the cost sometimes of it only being a timed license agreement versus an actual purchase, if only because we've now encountered students that are like, I don't really know what a DVD is, or I don't really know what a CD is for music. We've gotten to that point where, you know, they're all but not really knowing that physical media exists for the kinds of things they've used to entertain themselves with. Millersville for a long time has been a user of the Illiad interlibrary loan service. We're also a Rapid ILL user and have been for many years. We'll be moving to Project Reshare for physical sharing of resources in the not so distant future, and we hope that what we call Easy Borrow, which will be powered by Reshare in the not so distant future, will also be able to include some sharing of electronic items as well. We're also a big user of EBSCO Discovery Service all the way back to 2010 with all of the large EBSCO sort of centric databases underneath that for the purposes of discovery. So it's a little bit of lay of the land of the library here, where we like to think not on the bleeding edge here stateside, but probably a little bit on the leading edge for the way sort of a mid-sized liberal arts institution has thought about physicality, place, and resources in the sense of physical versus electronic.
All right, so that's our background for Millersville University specifically. But when we were approaching Millersville's OpenAthens setup, we actually needed to take a few other schools into account. For example, Millersville have dual enrollment programs with 3 of their sister schools. And what that means is students in certain academic programs have a right or are authorized to access content via Millersville's library as well as their home library. So that was one nuance that we had to sort of account for when we were conceptualizing the setup for Millersville. The goal was true single sign-on, but also the schools all agreed that at a certain point they would want to achieve some granular usage reports to sort of track that dual enrollment usage. And of course, to support this structure and that authorized access, we needed to be able to enforce some rules to say who had permission to access what. And this is over to Scott for the timeline that we were walking through. Scott, you might be muted. I'm not sure. We can't hear you.
Yeah, there we are. Now I'm unmuted.
Thanks.
A lot of politicking going on as it related to getting this all deployed properly and getting people lined up. Did that most of the year through 2017. We started the typical vendor cutover process in the spring of 2018 or thereabouts. We did a soft rollout, and it was really, really squishy at the front end in the sense that we took some low impact, we know we have use, but we don't have hordes of use vendors, and started those in the summer just to make sure we understood what we were doing and things were working as we thought they should be working. And then we did a broader, softer launch throughout late summer of 2018. We did not move everybody over simultaneously. We basically did 1 or 2 vendors at a time, made sure they worked, waited a few days, and then basically did that process again and again and again. We did about 4 or 5 iterations by the time we got through all of our major vendors at this particular point. So it was a relatively speaking orderly process, and we had no outages. And the one thing that's up there is the fact that we informed our university community of absolutely none of these changes. We made no announcements, we made no statements, we made no anything is changing kinds of anything, and had absolutely no complaints. All resources were deployed officially the first week in campus, the first week of the semester, so students were already here on campus, and they tend to be the most adaptable. And again, no comments, no feedback, no anything, and we were able to see usage take off right away. We did leave our old proxy service running during the background because we knew that there were going to be links that people had deployed and used, and we didn't know about those, so we've left the proxy service running. We also made no attempt to update any links to ebooks in our catalog. That was all sort of, we're going to swing back and get to that later. We had reason to think that nobody's really accessing our ebooks aggressively through the catalog, so that wasn't a big problem. We also moved various services over to OpenAthens. We were the first ones that we were aware of to flip the interlibrary loan application Illiad over to OpenAthens. We also use, as part of their suite at Atlas Systems, we also use Aries, Aeon, and it does actually work. For those of you that might have Illiad hosted by OCLC, you need to be very clear in saying you want to make a SAML connection, because if you say OpenAthens, they run off screaming and yelling, saying all kinds of things that are not quite technically accurate, but it does work. And it is worthy of noting that all of our Atlas systems applications are actually hosted by Atlas. They are not necessarily hosted by OCLC, nor are they hosted locally any longer. So again, this was one of the things that we were interested in making sure that we could get working properly, was not just the resources, but also the services. And Krista will speak about that a little later, in the sense that we wanted services to start experiencing the same sort of login user experience that resources historically has had. So a little bit about our doctoral programs, those professional programs. Those are the institutions. There's a doctorate of social work, there's a doctorate of education, there's a doctorate of something else that always eludes me, nursing, and those are the institutions that we're dealing with. So I had to also not necessarily politically lay the land at my own institution, but I had to convince these institutions as well to participate. And one of those three institutions is the institution which hosts the consortia's local proxy service. So they had some extra politicking to do to say, yes, we have people on the payroll that support the consortial proxy service and we don't want to use it anymore. So that was some sometimes awkward conversations, but nonetheless it happened. One thing that might be of import for other people is, because we're using OpenAthens to do this, and I was very circumspect in this, is the IT organizations involved at those institutions, Millersville, Kutztown, Shippensburg, and Westchester, never needed to establish any kind of actual trust relationship with each other, even though we're all in common Federation members, and one could think that that should be fairly straightforward to do. It's a political hot button issue for a whole bunch of reasons. So I was able to avoid that conversation in its entirety by saying, we'll get OpenAthens to do this and we'll put the logic in there. I just need you to give me some appropriate attributes, and local IT folks don't need to have that trust relationship conversation. Again, trying to avoid the politics of that whole setup. So users can choose where they want to log in, and they can access any resources in the library with their valid sets of credentials. So if a Kutztown user comes to the Millersville University Library, they're able to log in with their Kutztown credentials and vice versa. So years ago, we were able to ascertain that when students move between a course that's listed at Kutztown or Shippensburg and then a course that is listed at Millersville as part of the dual institution programming, they prefer to stick with a singular set of credentials. And moving, oh, I'm in a Millersville course, so I need to use Millersville, versus I'm in a Kutztown course, so I need to use Kutztown credentials, is plausible and technically works, but it was very much not the preferred solution from the end user standpoint. So if I took my first class at Kutztown, the tendency is that they want to use their Kutztown credentials for everything. If my first class was at Westchester, I want to use my Westchester credentials for everything. So we were able to meet that need, and it has greatly simplified things tremendously. And it also allows us to work around a lot of weird siloed institutional business logic, which makes things much more seamless to us and easier to explain to users. Basically, all we've done is ask OA to do some logic check, looking for some of those agreed upon attributes that will be sent to OA, and basically says, if you're a Kutztown or a Westchester student and you have told OA they hold this particular attribute, then you may let them log into Millersville University, because they are technically a Millersville University student. They're just choosing not to use the credentials that we've issued to them, which they wanted to use because they took their first class at a partner institution. Millersville does basically the same thing. The only sort of hiccup in the road has been, and we've sort of figured out how to do it, and it doesn't happen that often, is if a Kutztown student comes to Millersville and can't log in, they assume that there's something wrong with the Millersville library, which may be the case, but typically is not, is the fact that Kutztown has dropped delivering some attribute to us, so the logic falters. But that's generally reasonably easy to remedy. It's just got to be handled by that institution. It can't be handled by us, even though they are the ones asking us to provide access to something.
All right, so for any of our technical folks who are listening in and just wondering how we configured all of this in the back end, I just want to point out briefly that pulling together all of the 4 schools for this dual institution reciprocal access required us to connect each of those schools' identity providers or user directories to OpenAthens. So we have 4 schools. Each of those 4 schools has their own independent OpenAthens domain where we hook up all of their specific resources and subscriptions. And in each of those 4 domains, we connected all 4 schools' identity providers. So they all used some version of a SAML compliant identity provider. So to connect them, we just configured a simple one-to-one SAML connection. And what we're seeing here is the initial login screen that somebody sees when they're attempting to log into Millersville's library resources using OpenAthens. So as you can see, there are options to log in using any of the 4 schools' identity providers. And then because Scott and Krista manage accounts for walk-in users from their community, within OpenAthens, we actually have a 5th option to log in with an OpenAthens hosted account. And so when we first approached this implementation, OpenAthens didn't yet have the ability to connect to a SAML identity provider under more than one domain. Essentially, we needed Millersville students with Millersville directory accounts to be able to log in under Millersville's domain, but also under Shippensburg, Kutztown, and Westchester's domain. And so OpenAthens did undertake some development to support those duplicated SAML identity provider connections in each of the appropriate domains. Once we had that established, we were able to hook up each of the identity providers and support this really simple, easy to understand user experience for all 4 schools' OpenAthens access. Now, you might also be wondering how in OpenAthens we configure permissions rules to say who can access what. Because members of Kutztown University, using this example in this screenshot, who are enrolled in the Doctorate of Social Work program are the only Kutztown users who are authorized to access Millersville's library content. So we needed some way to filter for Doctorate of Social Work students and say those are the ones who are authorized, but people who are not in that program cannot access Millersville's library resources. So to do that, we set up a series of very simple if-then rules. If this URN OID string, which is a member of attribute, if the member of attribute contains this acronym that indicates Doctorate of Social Work membership, then they have access to Millersville resources. If it does not contain that value, then they do not have access to Millersville resources. So we are building upon the data that's managed in Kutztown's directory here. That Doctorate of Social Work acronym, that is something that's assigned to accounts in that group by Kutztown IT. So we are simply filtering on the data that Kutztown IT are managing in the back end. And in that same vein, Scott, it's back over to you to talk about working with IT.
Yeah, one of the things that we encountered early on with IT was they have no idea of who people are and don't really know that much about them. So this turned into a big political undertaking in the sense that the university's business logic is not necessarily understood by all of the players. They know their bit of it, and maybe a little bit about where it came from and where it goes to. But beyond that, it's really difficult to have a holistic conversation with anybody about what's the university's business logic for how we create student accounts. And one of the even more interesting things was there was not even general understanding of what constitutes a student, which was surprisingly hard to answer. So if you're going to go down this path and you want any kind of reports and granular access beyond yes, no, be advised that you're going to need to delve into that kind of understanding. And if you're, I suspect, a typical academic institution, that will be a harder conversation to have than you would think. Because most of what we know about a student is at the registrar's office. It's increasingly, or in our case, was not at the IT layer in the sense that they were working with very little data. So moving data around to authenticate, this is basically how we do it. It comes out of our student information system, flows into Active Directory, flows into a Shibboleth instance, and then Shibboleth connects to OpenAthens. There's a lot of lift to make that happen. So I ask for pieces of information very sparingly, again, because I'm asking somebody to do something, and the library is the only one who's asking. And most recently, we're getting some people that are sort of like, oh, well, that means we could do this, this, and this. So some of the lights are going on about we could be a little bit more innovative with this. But basically, again, IT is just taking what they're being told by the registrar, basically, and making it accessible in some way, shape, or form. So one of the things we're trying to do is to use OpenAthens to query Banner, our student information system, directly through an API for things that we know that the university will not release into AD, such as course time or course information in real time. Because what we're trying to do is think about providing access to specific resources by course, but we don't want to flow all that by course information through the directory structures. And we want to do it a little bit more efficiently.
All right, so before we jump into a few examples of the types of reports that Millersville and the other schools in this configuration are able to pull from their setup, I just want to talk a little bit about the approach to reporting when we were in the midst of this implementation with 4 schools. So all 4 schools who support this dual enrollment reciprocal access agreed that granular usage reports would help them make more informed decisions. So we wanted usage reports with actionable and relevant and current and accurate data breakdowns. The way that we went about that was first talking with the library to identify, in a perfect world, all else being equal, what reports will help you make those decisions? What data would be of great value to you? And once we knew those answers, then the conversation can move on to the IT or the IAM team who manages user data in the directory, where we could say, here are the reports that the library could use that would help them support all of their stakeholders in the university. Is there data available in the directory that could be shared with OpenAthens to support this type of tracking? So for example, we have here, this is actually quite a basic report. We have some user groups set up in Millersville's OpenAthens that tell us not just what university somebody is coming from, but also what affiliation they have. Are they a student? Are they a faculty member? Or are they a staff member? This is a really basic breakdown. And what we can do now is actually see accesses by group to specific applications or platforms. So we can see how many people who are logging into Illiad are part of the student group versus part of the faculty group, and so on and so forth. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I've worked with Scott and Krista over time to continue to optimize and update some of these more valuable features in their OpenAthens. So for example, one of the most recent changes we made to the data mappings was to begin receiving information about academic major and academic minor from their user directory. So now, over time, we can accrue data as to who is logging in from those different groups. We can see which academic programs are actually using the library the most. And if we wanted to, we could break this down by resource as well. So we could see how many people from each academic major or minor are actually submitting Illiad requests, and so on and so forth. And Scott, I'm going to click through this. This is our example of how somebody logs into Millersville's applications using OpenAthens.
Go ahead. Library's homepage, they're going to do a basic search. We're forcing everybody to log in, whether they're on or off campus, whether it's sunny outside or raining. You got to log in. You wind up at the university Shibboleth page, which basically is what students see for logging into anything. And then you wind up at a citation, and then I'm going to hand it off to Krista, who's going to tell you what happens with requesting the item. Oh, is this my slide still?
That's still your slide.
Yeah, okay, so here it is. We basically got a smart link that says, we know who you are. We've got a link here that takes you to the requesting service. And then we basically started having conversations about why are we forcing people to log into this service. Let's get this service going as well.
So our requested service feeds into Illiad, which is our interlibrary loan management system. And we randomly chose a green squirrel eons ago. So we just kind of go with that icon. It means nothing. So before OpenAthens, why do we keep forcing logins? They have to log into a database, they have to log into a service. We don't need to do that anymore. We know who they are and know their credentials, if they're a valid user or not. So after we deployed OpenAthens, now at least one login is no longer needed into our services. And our next step is a white rabbit, which the icon, with the white background there didn't show up so well. And the logic associated with that custom link tests for metadata. So I will go through those steps in just a second here. So if a request has insufficient metadata, so the record that is in the database is missing the ISSN, missing the publication year, then when a requester clicks on request this item, Illiad form is like, nope, not enough information. Let's give them the form, and they need to fill out what are the required pieces. They have to look up that information, and that just takes extra time, but is something that happens. Now, with the improved logic, and most of our records come through with a lot of information. We've reviewed what we consider required, and that information is now passed along from our databases, especially EDS, and it's passed to Illiad via an API. And now students, when they make a request, they don't have to log into the service. They don't even see the form. It's just thank you for your request. And so you might wonder, well, they need to tell us something about the request. Well, 4% of our requests had any kind of notes, and less than 1% of those had any kind of useful notes. Most of the time it was, thank you, it's a wonderful service, and that's great to hear, but we don't have to. The other really cool thing is duplication request checking, that if within that session, if they click on the same record, they can't request it again, because most people forget what they requested. So, next slide. The other really interesting thing that we've been able to do for niche database access is use OpenAthens as a bit of a leverage for our negotiation process. And we've talked to a number of vendors about resources that would only be appropriate for a specific course or a major, and would have a very small audience that would not relate to most of our students or faculty. And we can use the fact that we can narrow access down to just a small population as a negotiation tool to get the price down for a specific type of resource.
All right, so Scott, I think this is your slide,
Yep.
but I just want to comment first that it's been a labor of love to optimize all of these things for Millersville's OpenAthens, and it's a joy to get to share it with everyone.
Yeah, so things that are next on our list, basically are better attribute-based reporting. We have some items flowing now, faculty department, student major, student minor, where I learned that students may have up to 4 majors and up to 2 minors. It's shocking the number of them that have. We're talking about deploying OA in front of other things. We've got a few other items, services coming, but we're getting down to basically a handful. Course-based access via the Banner API is going to be our next thing, because that is information that the institution is already on record as saying we are not going to flow that kind of information through AD. And then obviously any kind of updates with IT.
All right, and I apologize to everyone. We ate a little bit into the lunch break, but thank you for your attendance and for listening.
I'm hungry, Amanda. No, I'm not. Thank you so much. We do have questions. I won't ask any of them now, just so people can have a comfort break before we come back. Just one observation, Scott, you know, the challenges around identity management you talked about. I was having a conversation with someone in the UK about exactly those issues. So it's great to get your perspective, and certainly that's hope that's a relationship between IT and the library that OpenAthens can help broker out into the future. But thank you so much. We will post those questions to you, and then, you know, just so you get a chance to answer them, and then we can reflect those back to the broader community as well.
Thank you.